Okay, now that we're back from break, I wanted to just kind of start getting into the basics. So let's just focus a little bit on the revenue piece. Revenue is anything that you sell and that you get cash for. We'll talk later about the cash flow. Cash flow is important. So after you've sold something, how long does it take you to get paid? That process is called cash flow. And there's a process of managing that in any business, especially a startup business. That's going to be critical to your success. It's okay to go out and sell stuff, but you still got to buy the product or services and pay your people until you get paid. So there's importance of managing that stream of time. But in this particular section, we're just going to talk about the revenue piece and how that is managed and accounted for. So anytime, basically a profit and loss statement is done at the end of every month, every quarter, and by at the 6-month part and at an annual mark. So most companies will either run it, they base it on a quarter, they base it on the half, and then at the end. So you have these milestones throughout the year, so you know how to gauge. So like a lot of times companies will say, on the last quarter of the year, they'll say, we've got a freeze. We have a hiring freeze. We've got to, we can't do anything silly. We've got to capitate our costs, meaning, we've got to just stay status quo for now until we can get past the rest of the year. Because that's typically the time when you get into the gap closure. If you're not seeing the revenue, or if your costs are starting to get higher, or your inventories are out of control, that's another thing we'll get into in the cash side, but that will limit you from being successful. So it gives you the time to kind of catch up and close the gaps. That's when you see people lay off people. That's when you see some pretty dramatic changes typically, because they're trying to because every year a company should set a goal of what they want to achieve that year. And typically put in a stretch target. So like when you see a P&L, profit and loss statement, it'll have it that maybe they budgeted throughout the year. So you basically have two buckets. One is what you're actually doing all the way down to the bottom line. And then there's another column within the P&L that is the budget that you're trying to get to. That they said, okay, we want to do $20 million this year in revenue, so they'll amortize that, meaning they divide that out over the course of the year in 12-month sections, quarterly sections, biannually and then annually, so that you can always have your running goal of where you're trying to get. And then there's a third column on the P&L that shows the variance. What variance means, it's what you're trying to get to, what you're budgeted to get to, minus what you did, equals the variance. The variance is either going to be plus or minus. So a good way to manage, to know at any given time how you're doing, is what I call the red, green, yellow. And it's just a good visual target. It helps you to know at any given time. You can look at your profit and loss statement and you know if you're hitting your goals. So if it's a negative on the revenue side, that means that you are missing your number. And if you make that cell on the Excel spreadsheet red, then you know that you're not meeting your target. If it's yellow, that means you're right at the bench. And then green means you're just over exceeding. So it's good to know at a quick visual, when you're just looking at your profit and loss statement for the first time, is to kind of go through and get into the habit of doing this visual presentation so that you know immediately where you're doing good and where you're doing bad. Because obviously, when you're doing good, you want to do better. And when you're doing bad, you want to bring it up to where it needs to be. So that would be my first recommendation. Look at it, and as depending on where you're coming at in the cycle, that's what you need to try to gauge. You making it, because sometimes you may be doing really good on 1 month, but you're missing the quarter. Quarter, just to make sure everybody's on the same page, is a 3-month span of time. It's important to understand what the fiscal year that business is in. Every business has their own physical benchmarks of time. For example, it could be a typical fiscal year, meaning I run my business and my business runs, start of my year is January 1, the end of it's December 31st. That's typical, but that's not all businesses do not do that. Some of them want to have a different span, or they're trying to tailor to a certain market, so they have different types of physical close. So like the business that I was in, we had a physical close at Toshiba. Our physical close was at the end of March, which is not typical. So when you're running a business, you kind of have to know, one, what is my client base and when do they close their business typically? Because certain industries are pretty parallel. Like for healthcare, they typically end in either July or September. So not all of them, but it's really important to align your thought process around, because as you get into the cash flow piece, behavior, like I said, it's like if you're running short, it drives behavior changes. So they'll be tighter with their cash, tighter to pay their bills, and those kinds of things. But when they're doing really good, then they'll pay them quicker. So you kind of need to be aligned to what your customers are doing, understand when your closes are, and that will help you to understand behavior within what you're being asked to do. So those are some important things that you should know. As far as the profit and loss statement, typically there's always, depending on the business, you can have a profit and loss statement based on the entire business. There's obviously one. So like in a huge corporation, you have the profit and loss statement. So back to what I was kind of saying, you have your budget of where you're trying to be, but most large corporations, they build in what's called a stretch target. But nobody in the company other than the power of the executive team understands what that stretch is. So everybody that's down here, you're running, as best you can to meet your budget. But in reality, they may put in a 10% stretch. So at the end of the day, you may have heard situations where you missed, you've run through the whole business, you've busted your ass trying to get there, and then you're thinking, oh my God, I didn't make my number. Well, and then after the fact, the beginning of the year comes, the press releases come, the stock report comes, and then they go, we're very excited that we made our number. And you're like, what does that mean? How could that have been? So that's why they put in stretch targets, just because they have to put in a buffer to make sure they hit their targets. So anyway, that's just something that every business does. So even if you're doing a small business, I recommend that you think about that. Always build in a safety net for you so that you can make sure you're successful. So that kind of gives us the big picture as far as how the P&L works. But at the end of the day, we need to know what to do with it. So that's what we're going to go into now. Back to the revenue piece. So that's on the revenue front. You're going to have your typical 80%. It may be 80% of your business typically is a certain amount of customers. Not always, but typically 80% of your business could be 10 customers, 100 customers. So when you're running a business, it's important to know who are making up my 80% of my revenue today. And it'll help you to understand, where the business may need to focus. Because if, say, you need 500 people to get to the same spot, then maybe you're putting your energy and it's too diversified. And maybe you need to focus more on building and leveraging larger business arrangements, partnerships with customers, so that you can focus the same amount of energy on a few customers versus on 500 customers. The 500 are important, but you go to market differently. So that's something that you need to consider and understand about your business today. Because it's so much easier to collect from 5 customers at the end of the day if you're trying to get the revenue in, get them to pay, versus it is the 500. So you can kind of see why I'm saying that. You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. I'm not saying that. But I am saying, diversification is important. But if you can focus on keeping it simple and going after 80%, being a few customers versus a lot, that will help your productivity and your efficiency within your business. The other part is upsell. And typically, you can look at it in a couple different ways, but 20% of your revenue typically is ancillary stuff. Ancillary meaning the other stuff. It could be